Hi guys, this is the video for Chapter 7, Lesson 4. So with this lesson, we are taking a look at finding percentages mentally. Now, attached in the study guides, you have this lesson here. However, today I'd like to take a little bit of a turn and not look at the study guide so much. So I'm going to explain to you what the study guide teaches and what it has us do. And then I'm going to simplify this lesson a little bit and just focus on the essentials, okay? So this lesson focuses on figuring out what a percentage of a number is mentally. And so the way that this book teaches you is by turning the percentage into a fraction and multiplying that fraction by the number. So, or finding the fraction of that number. So for example, if you're looking for 20%, 20% is actually 1/5. So if you're looking for 20% of 35, what you could do is mentally figure out what 1/5 of 35 would be. And so 1/5 of 35 is 7. So in this chart, it breaks down all the different fractions for these percentages, and then you use these fractions to help you figure out what these values are mentally. Now, we use percentages quite a lot in our daily life. We use percentages a lot when we are figuring out how much to tip somebody when we eat at a restaurant, or when we're looking at a sales rack and we see, oh, 30% off all things in the store. So percentages are a commonly seen math concept. So what I'd like to focus on today is really look at the essential percentages that we see in our daily life. So instead of looking at, like your study guide has, it has like, what's 37.5%, or what's 62.5%, or what's 66 2/3%. Well, that doesn't really occur all that much in our daily life. And so I want to focus on the percentages that we normally see and will normally use, or that will make the most impact when we're doing mental math. So the percentages that we're going to look at today are 100%, 50%, 10%, 5%, and then values that kind of are multiples of these numbers. So for example, 20%, that would be a multiple of 10%, double what 10% is. Or maybe like 60%, that would be a combination of 10% and 50%. So what we're looking at are these essentials up here, these 4 percentages, and then off of that, we'll look at different types of percentages by using what we figure out up here. So if I were to look at a percentage of 16, for example, okay, so I'm going to do this 50% of 16, of 16, of 16, okay? So I'm going to teach you a few tricks for finding the percentages of 16. Now, first of all, 100%, this is a no-brainer. 100% of a value is just that value, right? So 100% of 16 is just 16. So you didn't even have to do any work for that. Now, 50%. We can think of 50% as a fraction, and that might help us figure it out quickly, but 50% is really just half, right? So half of 16. What's half of 16? Well, that would be 8. So half of 100%, right, would be 100% of 16 would be 16, and then half of that would be 8. So you're really looking at half of that value. 10%. Now this one you're going to use a lot when you're going out to eat and you're figuring out how much to tip your waiter or your waitress. 10% is really easy to find. And I've gone out with friends to eat in my 20s after college, where we've been done with a meal and someone asks me, oh, how much is 20% of this bill or whatever? And I can't believe that my friend, as much as I love them, doesn't know the percentage, 10% or 20% of figuring out the cost of their meal. And so let me teach you a trick. 10% of any value, all you have to do is move the decimal over once, okay? So moving that decimal over once makes it 10%. Really what you're doing is you're dividing by 10. So you're doing 16 divided by 10. Well, 16 divided by 10 is 1.6. So 10% is 1.6. Now, if you were to find 5%, well, isn't 5% half of 10%? So all you really need to do is find what 10% would be and then divide that by 2. So 5% or half of 1.6, think of what's half of 16. It's 8, right? So 1.6 divided by 2 would be 0.8. And this one might be a little harder for you to kind of mentally think through what is it because of the decimals, but half of 1.6 is just 0.8. So you could think of half of 16 and then bring that decimal back in there, right? So bring that decimal back in. So it's 0.8. Now, if we already know that 10% of 16 is 1.6, then wouldn't 20% just be double what 10% is? And so if you wanted to tip your waitress or your waiter 20% off of your bill, and your bill was maybe $16 or something, or if you round it, maybe it's like $15.99 for your meal. Well, instead of trying to figure out $15.99, 20% of $15.99, just round it up and find 20% of 16. So 20% of 16 means I'm just going to find 10% and then double it. So what is double 1.6? 1.6 times 2. Okay, so if you want to just think through that 1.6, right? If you can even write it down, and that's 3.2, right? Double 1.6 is 3.2. So 20% of 16 is 3.2. It's just double what 10% would be. Now, if we're looking at 60% of 16, well, isn't that just 50% and 10% added together? Yeah, it's just that added together, right? So I could just do 8 plus 1.6, and the answer is 9.6. So 60% of 16 is 9.6. So if you saw a sale rack and it said 60% off all items, and maybe this shirt that you're looking at is $16, then that means it's $16 minus 9.6. So subtract that, and that's the cost of your shirt, which is really cheap, right? So 60% off is hard to beat. That's a good sale right there. Okay, so I actually created a little worksheet for us, and that's what we're going to use in our class. You can download this and print this off of RenWeb. It just is titled 7.4, find the percent of a number mentally. And so I'm not going to do all of this with you, but I've broken down these percentages of a number, and what we're going to do is just find the percentages of these amounts. And so each box is the same amount, and we're looking at the different percentages of that amount. So this really just takes practice, and you might develop little tricks that you found that help you or whatever, but we want to figure out how to find these things mentally, because these are the percentages that I think if you can figure this out mentally pretty quickly, you can find the other percentages easily as well. Like if I said, find 65% of a number. If you were good at finding 5% and you were good at finding 10% and you were good at finding 50%, just bring those all together and then you have 65%. So we'll start simple. 100% of 80, well, it's just 80, right? 50% of 80, that means what's half of 80? Well, half of 80 is 40. What's 10% of 8? So the trick with finding 10% is to move your decimal over once. 10% of 80 is 8. Okay. What's 5% of 80? Well, 5% is just half of 10%. So half of 10% is 4, like half of 8 is 4. And so half of 10% of 80 is 4. 15%, well, isn't 15% just 10% and 5% combined? So I could find those two, add them together. That would be 12. 15% of 80 is 12. 20%, well, isn't 20% double of what 10% would be? So what's 8 times 2? 16, right? So 16 is 20% of 80. Okay, got a number that doesn't look quite as easy to work with as 80, but I don't think we have as many percentages to do. So 100% of 53, 53. 50% of 53. So we need to think through what's 53 divided by 2. Well, you know, an easy way to think through this could be estimating, well, what's half of 50? Half of 50 is 25. So I know my answer is going to be about 25. So even if you have to work this out on the side, I know it says mentally, but you could work this out, right? That would be, my rating's not very good, so that's 13. And 2 times 6 is 12, remainder of 1. And so it's like, what, 26.5. So 50% of 53 is 26.5. Now, I prefer you to try to figure this out mentally, but if it comes down to it and you really need to work this out on the side, I'm not gonna be against you for that. Okay, 10%. Now, 10% is where you really don't need to use any work. You're just moving that decimal over. Move that decimal over, 5.3, right? Now, 20% is double what 10% is. So 5.3 times 2, that's 10.6. So if you think of 5.3 plus 5.3, that's 20%, right? That'd be 10.6. Okay, so let's take a look. 100% of 64, 64. Half of 64, 50% of 64. So that would be 32, right? Divide 6 by 2, divide 4 by 2, 32. 10% of 64, move that decimal over, 6.4. 5% of 64, that would be half of 6.4, so that's 3.2. And then 15%, so 15% is 10% plus 5%, so I'm gonna add them, 4 plus 2 is 6, 6 plus 3 is 9, so it's 9.6 there. And then 20%, well, that's double what 10% is. So 4 times 2 is 8, 6 times 2 is 12. So it's 12.8, and that's 20%. Okay, I think you can figure out number 4 on your own. I think you can do 5 and 7 on your own. I'd like you to work through those. And then I want to talk through some of these down here. So down here, it starts to shift a little bit. So read the directions carefully, read the problem carefully. 20% we've done, but then it goes to 40%, right? 30% and 60%. So think of if you found, let's say that we found 10% of 16, that's 1.6. Okay, we did this one together as a class, right up there. But 10% of 16, well, you're gonna multiply this by 3 to get 30%. So 1.6 times 3, or 16 times 3, do you know what that is? Well, that would be 48, but you might not know this. So you could do this on the side. What's 1.6 times 3, right? Multiply that out. 6 times 3 is 8, 18, and then 3 times 1 is 3, 3 plus 1 is 4, so it's 4.8. So 30% is 4.8. And then it says, what's 60% of 16? Well, think of these percentages. There's a relationship between 30 and 60. 60 is double what 30 is, so you can just double what this is. 4.8 times 2, that would be 8 times 2 is 16. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 plus 1 is 9, so it's 9.6. So 60% of 16 is 9.6. I think we might have done this problem right here together, but we didn't do 30%, right? So then you've got down here, you've got your basic ones that I've put. Then you have 50%. Then 60%, you could do 50 plus 10%, right? 70%, you could do 50 plus 20%. 65, you could do find 50%, find 10%, find 5%, and add them all together. So that one might be a little more work, but you can still do it mentally, especially with a number like 20. Okay, so try these out. Try these out on your own. I might put the answers up in a second, but it will take me a little bit to write them all down. So I will let you pause it, work them out, and then I might put the answers up. But before I do that, I want to take a look at this last part. This last part asks you to estimate what the amounts would be. So I want to talk through how to estimate your values. When you're reading a problem like this, 11% of 32. Well, if you know just like the general idea of how close 11% of 32 would be, um, I think that gives you a sense of just the number sense of what your answer should be close to. And so I want to talk through how should we translate these problems into the estimations. Okay, so looking at this, I might just look at this as 10% of 32 and work that out. So you're going to find an estimated answer. This one, I might do 5% of, honestly, I might round this to 40 of 40. That will be easier for me. This one, I'm going to round it to, you could do 50% or 55% just to keep things simple. 50% of, I'm going to round this up to 700. So 50% of 700. Here, I'm going to talk about this one in a second. Number 14, I'm going to look at this as 20% of 80. So once you've estimated, you're really doing the same thing as what we did up there in solving for the percentages. Now, if you have over 100%, my advice to you would be to find 100% of 9 and then 30% of 9 and add those together. So you're going to break up your 130 into 100% and 30%. Well, 100% of a number is just that number, right? So that's 9. 30% of 9, well, I'd have to think through what's 10% of 9. Oh, that's 0.9. 0.9 times 3 is like 2.7. So this one might take a little bit of thinking through what's 30% of 9. It's 2.7. So then if this is 9, this is 2.7. When I add them together, I will have 11.7 as 130% of 9. So this one was a little bit tricky, but just talking through how do you find over 100%. Break up that percent and do them in parts and then combine them back together. So go ahead and work out the rest of those, and I will put the answers of 5 and 7 up here just so you can check, okay? Okay, so let's check those answers. Didn't, do everything, but I just want to show you here that 5 and 7, those are the answers. If you want to pause it and check your answers, you're welcome to. That's a good benchmark to see how you're doing. And that's all I have for you guys today. So this is a big lesson, not in terms of it being difficult, but in terms of you are going to use this in your daily life a lot. So if you're able to figure out this mental math stuff quickly and feel comfortable with it, you're going to look like a math genius to a lot of your friends, a lot of other people that maybe haven't honed in on this skill, or you'll just be able to use it, in your daily life more conveniently. And you don't have to take out your phone or your calculator and figure things out every time.